First lieutenant pulled his 190 into position 800 meters behind the American bomber formation. October 8, 1943, 22,000 feet over, his fourth interception that week. The textbook said tail attacks were safest, approach from 6 o'clock low. The American gunner sits alone back there, isolated, cold, watching empty sky. Wait until 400 meters, open fire, the shatters first, then the gunner, then the bomber falls. Had done this 17T. Me's 17 American bombers, 17 tail gunners who never got a shot off. He pushed the throttle forward. The B-17 ahead grew larger in his gun sight 700 meters, 600 meters, standard approach. The tail gunner position showed no movement yet. Americans always waited. Their training manuals said conserve ammunition. Wait for close range. 500 meters. Tracers erupted from the bomber's tail. Too early, far too early, jerked the stick left. The tracers walked toward him, adjusting, climbing. Orange lines across black sky. He broke off the attack at 450 meters. His wingman followed. The bomber flew on untouched. Someone back there wasn't following the manual. At 6:15 on July 30th, 1943, Staff Sergeant Michael crawled into the tail position of B-17 at RAF, watching a gray English dawn that would carry him 500 miles into Germany. 24 years old, 12 combat missions completed. 3 confirmed kills. They had positioned over 300 fighters along the route too. Settled onto the bicycle seat that served as his workstation. The tail gunner position measured 4 feet wide and 5 feet long. 2 Browning M250 caliber machine guns pointed backward through a window. At 25,000 feet, the temperature outside would drop to negative 60 degrees Fahrenheit. His electrically heated suit was the only thing between survival and death by hypothermia. The 8th Air Force called it the loneliest job in the war. The tail gunner worked alone, separated from the rest of the crew by 40 feet of aluminum fuselage. No one to talk to. No one to help if something went wrong. Just a man, 2 guns, and whatever the sent his way. The statistics told the story. In the summer of 1943, the average B-17 crew survived 11 missions before being shot down, killed, or captured. Tail gunners died faster than anyone except ball turret gunners. German fighter pilots preferred attacking from the rear. The tail position absorbed the first bullets. By July, the 379th Bombardment Group had already lost 9 aircraft in just 2 months of operations. 90 men gone. The problem was geometry. German pilots understood that approaching from behind gave them the longest possible firing window. A Messer Bf 109 closing at 350 miles per hour from the 6 o'clock position had nearly 10 seconds to aim and fire before passing the bomber. The tail gunner had those same 10 seconds to hit a target moving at combined speeds approaching 600 miles per hour. Most tail gunners never got the chance. The 190 carried 2 20mm cannons and 2 13mm machine guns. A single burst could shred the bubble, kill the gunner, and disable the tail controls. Bombers without tail protection became easy targets. The fighters would circle back, line up, and finish the job. The standard Army Air Force's gunnery training taught gunners to wait, conserve ammunition, fire only at ranges under 300 yards. The theory made sense in a classroom. In combat, 300 yards meant the enemy was already shooting. Had watched it happen. On his 6th mission, a B-17 flying off's right wing took a direct hit to the tail section. The gunner never fired a shot. The fighter came in fast, guns blazing, and the first rounds punched through before the American could react. The bomber fell out of formation, trailing smoke. 8 parachutes emerged. The tail gunner was not among them. Other crews had noticed something about. Mission after mission came home. Not just survived, came home without serious tail damage. While other bombers in the 527th Squadron landed with shot-up tail sections, missing gunners, shredded control surfaces, his tail remained intact. The crew chief had started calling it luck. "It's got a guardian angel back there," he told the other ground crew. "Germans just can't hit him." Some pilots agreed, pure statistical chance. Fly enough missions, and some crews avoid the worst of it. The law of averages meant someone had to be lucky. His number just hadn't come up yet. In the squadron-ready room, other tail gunners asked about his secret. He said he followed doctrine, aimed carefully, conserved ammunition, nothing special. But his ammunition counts told a different story. After each mission, the armorer recorded how many rounds each gunner had expended. Most tail gunners came back with 600 to 700 rounds remaining out of their 800-round load. They fired in short, disciplined bursts, just as training demanded. Consistently returned with fewer than 200 rounds. The squadron gunnery officer called him in after the 8th mission. "You're burning through ammunition like it's target practice," the officer said. 4 times the normal consumption rate. That's not luck, that's waste. Said he was engaging targets at extended range. The officer frowned. Extended range means low hit probability. You're violating doctrine for no tactical gain. But kept flying and kept coming home. Maybe it was luck. Or maybe it was something else. 186 B-17's lifted off from bases across eastern England that morning. 123 P-47 Thunderbolts would escort them partway, but fuel limitations meant the fighters would turn back over Belgium. The bombers would fly the final 200 miles to Alone. Checked his ammunition belts, 400 rounds per gun. 800 total. The manual said that was enough for a standard mission. Had already decided the manual was wrong about everything else. By noon, he would find out if he was right. The cost of being wrong was a closed casket funeral and a telegram to his family. The formation crossed the English Channel at 14,000 feet, still climbing. Watched the water recede through his window. The white cliffs of Dover shrank to a pale line on the horizon. Ahead lay occupied France, then Belgium, then the heart of Nazi Germany. The P-47 escorts held position around the bomber stream. Their presence meant safety, but knew the arithmetic. The Thunderbolts carried enough fuel for roughly 90 minutes of combat flying. The mission would take 6 hours. For most of the journey, the bombers would fly alone. Had spent his first missions following doctrine: wait for the fighter to close, aim carefully, fire in short bursts. Conserve ammunition. The training instructors at gunnery school had drilled it into every student. Ammunition was limited. Accuracy mattered more than volume. A disciplined gunner could make 800 rounds last an entire mission. The doctrine assumed the enemy would cooperate. They did not. German pilots had studied American tactics. They knew the gunners waited until 300 yards, so they opened fire at 600 yards, pouring cannon shells into the bomber formations while the Americans held their triggers. By the time the tail gunners started shooting, the damage was already done. 3 bombers from the 527th Squadron had gone down in July alone, 30 men lost. 2 of those bombers had taken fatal damage to their tail sections. The gunners had followed doctrine perfectly. They had waited for optimal range. They had conserved ammunition. They had died with full ammunition belts. Lieutenant James, pilot of B-17 Lady Luck, had watched his tail gunner get killed on a mission to Hamburg. The German fighter approached from directly astern, textbook attack angle. The American gunner held fire, waiting for the range to close. The German opened up at 550 yards. The first 20mm shell destroyed the tail gun position. The second shell severed the elevator controls. Lady Luck fell out of formation and crashed into the North Sea. Was the only survivor. He told the story at the debriefing. "My gunner did everything right," said. "Everything the manual told him to do, and he's dead because of it." The intelligence officer made a note in the mission report, but the doctrine remained unchanged. The 8th Air Force had invested millions of dollars developing gunnery training. Thousands of instructors had taught tens of thousands of gunners. The system was based on careful analysis and testing. The system was getting men killed. Now crossing into Belgium on July 30th, watched the P-47 escorts waggle their wings and turn back toward England. The bombers pressed on alone. Somewhere ahead, 300 German fighters were waiting. By mid-August, other squadrons had started noticing the same pattern. Some tail gunners survived missions that should have killed them. Most followed doctrine and died. A handful broke the rules and lived. At RAF Thorpe, home of the 100th Bombardment Group, a tail gunner named Robert Hayes had survived 9 consecutive missions without taking a hit to his position. Hayes expended 3 to 4 times the normal ammunition load. He engaged German fighters at ranges the training manual called wasteful. The pattern was too consistent to ignore. The 8th Air Force Gunnery Board convened a study in September. They examined ammunition expenditure reports from 30 bombardment groups. The data showed a correlation between high ammunition usage and tail gunner survival rates. Gunners who fired more rounds were less likely to be killed. But correlation wasn't causation. The Gunnery Board needed to understand the mechanism. One theory emerged. The Americans had secretly modified their ammunition. The standard .50 caliber round had an effective range of roughly 1,000 yards. But effective range was a statistical measure, the distance at which a trained gunner could expect to achieve a certain hit probability under ideal conditions. Real combat conditions were never ideal. What if the Army Air Forces had developed a new round with improved ballistics, extended range, flatter trajectory, better accuracy at distance? They wouldn't announce it publicly. Ammunition specifications were classified, but they might issue it quietly to specific units for field testing. That would explain everything, and Hayes weren't violating doctrine. They were testing new ammunition that actually worked at extended ranges. Their high expenditure rates reflected the reality that the new rounds performed better than the old ones. Their survival proved the ammunition was effective. The theory spread through the bomber groups. Ground crews started inspecting ammunition belts more carefully, looking for visual differences. Some claimed to see variations in the cartridge cases. Others reported that certain missions received different ammunition loads than others. Intelligence officers interrogated German prisoners about American gunnery. Had they noticed any change in tracer characteristics, any increase in hit probability at long range, any indication that American ammunition had improved? The German pilots reported no change. American tail gunners remained predictable. They held fire until close range. They died in predictable numbers. Except for the handful who didn't. The Gunnery Board sent inspectors to examine ammunition supplies. They pulled samples from ammunition belts. They measured the rounds, weighed them, compared them to standard specifications. The ammunition was completely normal. Standard M250 caliber ball rounds, manufactured at Lake City Army Ammunition Plant, identical to the ammunition every other tail gunner in the 8th Air Force was using. There was no secret weapon, no modified ammunition, no technical advantage. Was using the same ammunition as everyone else. He was just using it differently. And that difference was keeping him alive while others died. Had calculated the problem differently. A 190 at 600 yards was not a difficult target. It was flying straight toward him, nose pointed directly at his position, presenting the largest possible profile. The closure rate meant the apparent size doubled every few seconds. A gunner who started firing early could walk his tracers onto the target, adjusting aim as the range decreased. The risk was ammunition. 800 rounds sounded like a lot until you divided it by the number of attacking fighters. A mission might see 15, 20, even 30 separate attacks. At 50 rounds per burst, the mathematics turned brutal. A gunner who fired early might run dry before the mission ended. Accepted the trade-off. A gunner who conserved ammunition but died on the third attack had made a poor bargain. Survival required disrupting the enemy's attack before it succeeded. If that meant running low on bullets, he would deal with that problem later. Dead men had no use for reserve ammunition. The geometry favored the aggressive approach in ways the training manual never acknowledged. When a fighter approached from directly astern at 600 yards, it was flying straight and level, committed to its attack run. The pilot had to hold steady to aim his guns. Any evasive maneuver, meant breaking off the attack entirely. But if the bomber gunner opened fire early, the fighter pilot faced an immediate decision: continue the attack through incoming fire or break off early and try again. Most pilots broke off. Fighter pilots were offensive weapons. They attacked bombers because bombers were slow, predictable targets that couldn't shoot back effectively. But a bomber that filled the sky with tracers at 600 yards suddenly wasn't an easy target anymore. It was a threat. That trained its pilots to exploit American predictability. German fighter tactics assumed the tail gunner would hold fire until 300 yards. At that range, the fighter was already shooting. The German pilot could pour cannon shells into the bomber for a full 3 seconds before the American gunner even pulled his trigger. 3 seconds was enough to kill a tail gunner. But if the American opened fire at 600 yards, the timing reversed. Now the German pilot faced 6 seconds of incoming fire before reaching his own effective range. 6 seconds to watch tracers walking toward his cockpit. 6 seconds to decide whether this bomber was worth dying for. Most decided it wasn't. Had first tested the theory on his 4th mission, a raid against submarine pens at San, in June. A pair of Bf-109s approached from the 6 o'clock low position. The classic tail attack. Standard doctrine said wait. Opened fire at 700 yards. The tracers arced across the sky, falling short at first, then climbing toward the lead fighter. The German pilot saw the fire coming and broke off his attack, diving away before reaching effective cannon range. His wingman followed. Neither fighter scored a hit on. The crew chief questioned after landing. The ammunition count showed he had expended nearly 200 rounds on a single engagement. At that rate, he would run out before reaching targets deep inside Germany. Explained his reasoning. The goal wasn't to achieve kills. The goal was to survive. If early fire disrupted the attack, the ammunition was well spent. A bomber that came home with empty guns was more valuable than a bomber that went down with full magazines. The crew chief remained skeptical. Other tail gunners heard about the incident. Some called it reckless. Wasting ammunition on long-range shots violated everything the Army Air Forces taught. The training manuals existed for a reason. Was gambling with his crew's lives. But kept coming home. Mission after mission, the bomber returned to with its crew intact. Other aircraft in the 527th Squadron were not so fortunate. By mid-July, 3 bombers from the squadron had gone down. 30 men lost. Lieutenant Harold Miller's pilot noticed something during the 5th mission. German fighters that approached from the rear would break off their attacks earlier when was firing. They didn't commit to close-range gun runs. They stayed cautious, testing the defenses, looking for easier targets. Miller mentioned it to the squadron commander. "It's keeping them honest," Miller said. "They're not getting clean shots anymore." The pattern held through June and into July. Flew 9 missions without serious tail damage. Other bombers came back with shredded tail sections, wounded or dead gunners, disabled control surfaces. His tail remained intact. The ammunition expenditure remained high. Was burning through 600 to 700 rounds per mission, leaving him with barely enough for emergency situations. But the emergency situations stopped happening. German fighters started avoiding. They would approach, see the early tracer fire, and shift their attacks to other bombers in the formation. Bombers whose tail gunners followed doctrine. Bombers whose gunners waited for optimal range. Bombers that were easier to kill. On July 28, 2 days before the mission, scored his first confirmed kill. A Bf-109 approached from 5 o'clock high. Opened fire at 650 yards. The German pilot continued his attack run, either brave or foolish. The tracers walked up the fighter's engine cowling. Smoke erupted. The Bf-109 rolled inverted and fell away. The other crew members witnessed the kill. The gun camera footage confirmed it. Intelligence officers the claim. 1 confirmed kill, 12 missions completed. But more importantly, 12 missions survived. The squadron intelligence officer, asked to explain his technique at the next combat briefing, stood in front of 40 tail gunners and described his approach. Fire early, disrupt the attack, accept the ammunition cost. Some gunners were interested. Most remained skeptical. The training manual was the training manual. You didn't survive combat by ignoring official doctrine. But had survived 12 missions. Most of the skeptics hadn't survived 6. The mission on July 30th lasted 7 hours, encountered 16 separate fighter attacks, expended all 800 rounds and had to borrow ammunition from the waste gunners. He claimed 4 enemy fighters destroyed, 2 probables. The gun camera footage confirmed 3 kills. Intelligence credited him with 1 additional probable. 4 confirmed kills in a single mission. His total stood at 5. But the mission cost the 379th Bombardment Group 2 bombers, 20 men gone. Both bombers had taken fatal damage from tail attacks. Both tail gunners had followed standard doctrine. The squadron gunnery officer finally understood. On August 3rd, he filed a report with 8th Bomber Command Headquarters. The report documented survival rate, his ammunition expenditure, his tactics, and his results. The officer recommended immediate revision of tail gunnery doctrine to authorize early engagement at extended ranges. The recommendation went up through channels, group level to wing level to Bomber Command. Brigadier General Frederick Anderson, commander of 8th Bomber Command's operational planning, reviewed the findings personally. The implications extended beyond individual aircraft. If coordinated early fire from multiple bombers could disrupt mass fighter attacks, the entire defensive doctrine might require revision. The formal policy change came in November. New gunnery guidelines authorized tail gunners to engage targets at extended ranges when tactical conditions permitted. The bureaucratic language was cautious, but the meaning was clear. The approach that had kept alive was becoming official doctrine. Never saw the policy take full effect. His head injuries from a ditching in the English Channel in September proved more serious than initial assessments indicated. After returning to flight status in late September, he completed 3 additional missions before medical officers grounded him permanently. Recurring headaches and vision problems made continued combat duty impossible. His final tally stood at 17 confirmed kills, with 4 additional probables awaiting verification. The number placed him among the highest-scoring bomber gunners in the 8th Air Force. Some records credited him with as many as 19 victories, though documentation inconsistencies made precise counts difficult. The Distinguished Flying Cross followed the Distinguished Service Cross. 2 air medals with oak leaf clusters recognized his cumulative combat achievements. The Purple Heart acknowledged his wounds. By the time his combat career ended, had accumulated more decorations than most pilots. The 379th Bombardment Group continued operations for another 18 months, flying through the winter of 1943, the invasion summer of 1944, and the final campaigns of 1945. The tactics had pioneered spread throughout 8th Bomber Command. Tail gunners across the 8th Air Force adopted variations of early engagement doctrine. The statistical impact emerged gradually. Bomber loss rates declined through 1944, though multiple factors contributed. But defensive gunnery played a role, and the shift toward aggressive fire was part of that improvement. German fighter pilots noticed the change. Interrogation reports from captured aircrew mentioned the increased danger of tail attacks against American formations. The easy kills that had characterized early bomber interceptions became progressively harder to achieve. Some pilots shifted entirely to head-on attacks, accepting the higher closure rates in exchange for avoiding concentrated rear hemisphere fire. First Lieutenant, the pilot who had encountered unexpected tail fire in October, was shot down over in December 1943. He survived and spent the rest of the war in a British POW camp. After the war, he was interviewed by American military historians researching bomber defensive tactics. Remembered the change clearly. In the summer, we could approach from behind with confidence, he said. By autumn, the tail gunners were shooting from 600 meters or more. Not accurate, but enough to force us to maneuver. It broke up our attack formations. Made everything more difficult. The interviewer asked if the change had affected German tactics. Of course, said. We started avoiding bombers with aggressive tail gunners. Why attack a difficult target when easier ones were available? The Americans learned to make themselves difficult. Shipped home to the United States in early 1944. The Army Air Forces assigned him to training duties, passing his combat experience to new gunners preparing for deployment overseas. He spent the remainder of the war teaching others the techniques that had kept him alive. The students who passed through his courses carried his methods into combat over Germany, over Japan, over every theater where American bombers faced enemy fighters. Michael did not leave military service after the war ended. He transferred to the newly formed United States Air Force in 1947 and continued serving for another 15 years. The man who had survived the deadliest skies over Europe chose to remain in uniform until 1962, retiring at the rank of Master Sergeant. The decision puzzled some who knew his history, had accumulated enough combat experience for several lifetimes. He had been wounded twice, ditched in the English Channel, and faced death more times than official records could capture. Saw it differently. The Air Force had given him purpose during the darkest years of the century. The skills he developed had saved lives, not just his own, but the crews who flew with him and the gunners who learned from his methods. His post-war years were quiet. He married, raised a family, and rarely spoke about his combat experiences. The medals stayed in a drawer. The memories stayed locked away. Like many veterans of his generation, believed that those who had not been there could never truly understand. Elmer's navigator took a different path. He became a journalist and author, eventually writing a memoir titled The Fall of Fortresses. The book described the crew's experiences in detail, preserving moments that might otherwise have been lost to history. This account ensured that, and her crew would not be forgotten. The 379th Bombardment Group held reunions for decades after the war. Veterans gathered to remember friends who had not returned, to share stories their families had never heard, to honor the young men they had once been. Attended when his health permitted, reconnecting with survivors from those desperate months over Europe. The National Cemetery of the Pacific received his remains on February 20th, 1990. He had died 5 days earlier in St. Augustine, Florida, at the age of 70. The headstone listed his rank, his service branch, and his war. It did not mention the 17 fighters he had destroyed, or the crews he had protected, or the doctrine he had helped reshape. Military cemeteries are full of such understatements. The stones mark names and dates, but cannot capture the weight of what those names represent. Lies among thousands of other veterans, each with stories that deserve telling. The mighty 8th Air Force Museum in Savannah, Georgia, preserves the history of the bomber crews who flew from England. The 379th Bombardment Group's records are archived there, including mission reports that document combat achievements. Researchers can trace the evolution of gunnery doctrine through documents that bear his influence. The B-17 tail gunner position no longer exists. The aircraft that carried men like into combat have mostly vanished, reduced to museum pieces and memorial displays. But the principles he demonstrated endure: the value of aggressive action over passive defense, the willingness to challenge doctrine that was getting men killed, the recognition that survival sometimes requires breaking the rules that were supposed to keep you safe. Staff Sergeant Michael flew 15 combat missions. He destroyed 17 enemy aircraft. He survived when most tail gunners did not. He survived because he understood something the training manual never taught. Sometimes the only way to follow the rules is to break them first.